On December 30th, 2019, Dr. Ai Fen, director of the emergency department at Wuhan Central Hospital, forwarded a photo of a patient's lab results containing the phrase SARS coronavirus to a former medical school classmate. This photo quickly spread throughout the Wuhan medical community and China more broadly. Scrambling to suppress news of the virus, hospital authorities cracked down on Dr. Ai, reprimanding her for spreading rumors and harming stability. A few months later, she was interviewed by the Chinese magazine Renwu, Mandarin for China's people. In the interview, Dr. Ai said the following: "If I had known what was about to happen, I would not have cared about the reprimand. I would have fucking talked about it to whoever, wherever I could." Four days after Dr. Ai shared news of the existence of the virus with medical school classmates, China's National Health Commission published an order on January 3rd forbidding the publication of any information regarding the disease, while laboratories were told to destroy or transfer all viral samples to designated testing institutions run by the state. Only 8 days after this, on January 11th, a professor from Fudan University, Zhang Yongzhen, published the first known genetic sequence of the virus online, disregarding the contents of the National Health Commission's order. Having a freely available representation of the COVID-19 genome was extremely important. It provided the foundation for researchers across the globe to begin looking at vaccine development. And within 103 days of January 11th, when Professor Zhang published the first known genetic sequence of the COVID-19 virus, AstraZeneca moved its first vaccine candidate to phase 1 clinical trials. In about the same time period, 20,000 additional samples of COVID-19 were mapped by scientists as the virus moved throughout the world, changing genetic sequence and genetic makeup along the way. The courage and bravery of Dr. Ai and Professor Zhang can't be understated. While they were trying to understand the scientific underpinnings of what they were seeing in their lab and hospital, they chose to question, resist, and defy orders from the Chinese Communist Party. In so doing, they did a service to humanity, getting the word out of a deadly virus and quickening the pace of the development of vaccines so we could move forward. 3 years later, we still do not know the origins of the COVID-19 virus. It's not to imply that we necessarily should. I don't know what a reasonable expectation is to have this information. I'm not a virologist or an immunologist or anything like that. In 2002, 2003, when the SARS virus broke out, it took 15 years to determine the origin of how it moved from an animal species into human beings. There are 4 prevailing theories regarding how the COVID-19 virus originated in Wuhan, China, 2 of which are put forward by the Western world and 2 others by Chinese government officials. The 2 theories in the Western world are a natural spillover from animal to human, so something from like a bat to a human being in a Wuhan wet market, and the second being a research-related incident, the lab leak theory. The 2 theories put forward by Chinese government officials are quite different. One was that it arrived in China on the surface of imported frozen seafood. Another is that it was brought into China by infected people or animals after being created by the US military. The battle for which theory ultimately ends up being the accepted truth is a very important one, obviously. Who controls the past controls the future. Who controls the present controls the past, to quote George Orwell. Putting aside the two theories put forward by Chinese government officials for the moment, wanted to talk about the evidence that has been presented for and against the two theories that are predominant in the Western world, the natural spillover and the lab leak theory. There are 3 documents which I'll draw upon to describe this evidence. First is footage from the House Subcommittee hearing on COVID-19 origins that took place in July 2021. Second is a declassified report from the Office of the Director of National Intelligence, the National Intelligence Council, released in August 2021. And finally, there is a Senate report, interim report, an analysis of the origins of the COVID-19 pandemic from the Senate Committee on Health, Education, Labor, and Pensions. Okay, so let's go over the official government documentation and sources chronologically. First is the House Subcommittee hearing on COVID-19 origins. Occurred in July 2021. Before getting into the content, I want to admit something to you. I've got 2 man crushes on two of the representatives that were conducting this hearing. First is Representative Bill Foster, Democrat from Illinois, the only PhD physicist in Congress. Before being a member of Congress, he started a company that manufactures over half of the theater lighting equipment in the United States. So next time you go see a movie at AMC or whatever the movie theater company names are, this dude's business probably created the lighting. And then he went to a national lab, Fermi National Lab, and member of the team that discovered the top quark, heaviest known form of matter. He didn't go like the middling quark or the second best quark. He went top quark. This dude discovered it. He was a member of the team that discovered it. And now he's chair of the House subcommittee that is investigating the COVID-19 origins. And he had this to say in his introduction in the hearing.
Because in politics, it's often very different. If you see something interesting, the first question is often not what is true, but what can you convince people is true? Sort of like a lawyer convincing a jury. Instead of looking at the full set of facts, we look to cherry pick facts to support your political position. And when this happens, it often leads to bad policy that, in the case of COVID-19, has killed hundreds of thousands of people around the world. Like so many important topics in science, the deliberate endeavor of establishing origins of COVID is likely nowhere near as simple as we'd like it to be. If epidemiology were easy, we'd have the answer by now. If the intelligence community were in possession of a smoking gun about COVID origins, I believe that we would have heard about it. Our witnesses are going to help steer the origins conversation to the high road, where scientific expertise, transparency, objectivity, and data are paramount.
Representative Foster talking data to me. I dig it. Second Congresshuman crush from this hearing, Representative Jay Obernolte, Republican from California, before going into politics, got a master's degree in artificial intelligence in 1997. Were you thinking about artificial intelligence in 1997? This dude was. And then he created a video game development studio. He's a certified flight instructor. He's a teacher of martial arts. Impressive guy. And in the hearing, in addition to some incisive questions to witnesses, he also brought up a great point about social media's role in disseminating information, accurate information, about crises like the COVID-19 pandemic when they arise.
During the onset of the pandemic, some media outlets latched onto a preordained narrative about the origins of COVID-19, dismissing competing theories as false and even xenophobic conspiracy theories. Social media companies then censored information about COVID's origins, labeling posts as misinformation, despite there being no conclusive evidence for one theory over another. The unfortunate effect of these actions was to shut down legitimate scientific discourse and inquiry, which I think is important to everyone on this committee.
Great job by those two. I'm sure they're giddy to get an endorsement from a random dude in his home office with a handful of YouTube subscribers. Not even a handful, like a hand half full. Got like 3 subscribers. So, you're welcome. In terms of the content of the hearing and the testimony of some of the expert witnesses, I was also impressed by Dr. David Relman, a professor at Stanford in microbiology and immunology. And he set up the discussion regarding the two competing theories this way. And again, remember, this is July 2021.
Soon after disease first appeared in Wuhan, China, the causative agent was identified, a coronavirus called SARS-CoV-2, whose closest known relatives are found in bats in southern China. The key question became, how, when, and where did SARS-CoV-2 first encounter and infect a human? There are 2 major hypotheses. First, a natural spillover, in which the virus jumped directly from a bat or indirectly from another animal to a human. And second, a laboratory-associated mechanism. Both hypotheses involve human activities, but suggest different opportunities for risk reduction going forward. What is the evidence in support of these hypotheses? First, despite much analysis and discussion, the sequence of SARS-CoV-2 tells us only so much. The problem is that the immediate ancestors of this virus are missing. The most closely related known virus is not that closely related. Meanwhile, SARS-CoV-2 has not been found in nature.
It should be noted here that the Chinese government limited access to investigators from the World Health Organization in the early stages of the pandemic. If those investigators were given access at that time, it's more likely that they would have been able to track down the specific animal that transferred the COVID-19 virus to human beings. Assuming, of course, natural spillover theory is correct.
And it had not been reported from a laboratory prior to 2020. So, where does this leave us? We have only circumstantial evidence. Neither hypothesis can be ruled in nor ruled out. Both are plausible.
After providing this overview of the two hypotheses regarding the origins of the COVID-19 pandemic, Dr. Relman, later in the hearing, provided details on some of the experiments that were taking place at the Wuhan Institute of Virology that he found particularly concerning.
You didn't touch on it a lot in your testimony today, but in your written testimony, I was interested in when you were talking about the Wuhan Institute of Virology and the possibility of a lab leak from that institution. You discussed some of the practices for studying viruses there that you consider risky. Can you talk a little bit more about that?
Sure. I am concerned about the sort of the unregulated lack of proper discussion about how we go about examining diversity in nature. And I fully support the statements that have been made by Drs. Murray and Price and Perlman. But when we collect lots of sequences, we have to ask, what's their relevance? And the way in which some of this relevance is determined is by scientific experimental means, either by trying to grow the entity that we think resides within the sample, or by trying to recreate it or study a piece of it. And what I think concerns me is that we haven't yet had a proper discussion about where there may be risk in some of these experiments, not the majority, but some of it, that hasn't been properly addressed and that we need to sort of confront and discuss more openly. And I'll just call out a certain set of experiments that have been published by the Wuhan Institute that I view as particularly risky. In this work, they started with a natural isolate, a bat coronavirus called WIV1, which a good friend and colleague of mine, Ralph Barrick, had already studied and declared to be a virus poised for human emergence. This is WIV1, came out of a bat in Wuhan Institute of Virology. And their approach for studying novel sequences that they found in other samples was to take a piece of those genomes, a piece of that sequence, and swap it into this WIV1 virus. They then resurrected a few of those viruses and grew them in the laboratory. So now we're talking about a chimeric virus with properties that we don't know yet. We can't predict well. That was the purpose of the experiment. Those are experiments that concern me. And I'm not saying that they led to this outbreak or pandemic by any means, but it's simply the kind of work that I think we as a scientific society need to think much more clearly and more deliberately about before we undertake it. Again, in the search of answers to important questions about the diversity in nature.
If I'm understanding Dr. Relman correctly here, the experiments that concern him are ones where you take genetic sequence of one virus and mix them with other viruses, thereby creating a sort of Frankenstein virus, the characteristics of which are completely unknown and unpredictable. And here, I couldn't agree more with him on this point. Time and again through history, human beings have created technological advance, industrial advance, with little consideration of the consequences. And for these experiments to not have a certain level of scrutiny, external scrutiny, to them, it's a recipe for disaster, frankly. And so I don't know how we could establish that scrutiny or the checks and balances that would be required so that we would sensibly implement these sorts of experiments. But it's a question that needs to be explored. There are two other sources of information that I wanted to touch on briefly before wrapping up here. First is the National Intelligence Council's assessment on the COVID-19 pandemic origins from late last year, late 2021, and includes information through August of 2021. In this assessment, there are a few areas of broad agreement across the intelligence community that are important to call out. First is that it was not developed as a biological weapon. It was not genetically engineered, and Chinese officials were unaware of the virus before the pandemic emerged. So that's a foundation that we can be extremely confident in. The second important point in the NIC's assessment was that the intelligence community concluded that they'd be unable to reach a definitive explanation for the origin of the COVID-19 pandemic without a higher degree of cooperation from the Chinese government. And he cited two events that occurred which illustrate how the CCP, the Chinese Communist Party, impeded investigation into the pandemic's origins. First is that Chinese government limited the World Health Organization investigation team's access to sites around Wuhan to try to understand if and how the virus leapt from animal to human. Second is that in July of 2021, China denounced a World Health Organization plan for future investigations into COVID-19 origins, claiming that the lab leak theory was a conspiracy theory and that it did not warrant additional investigation. Given the intelligence community's reluctance to make a definitive conclusion regarding the origins of the pandemic, it was surprising to see in October 2022 an analysis of the origins of the COVID-19 pandemic, an interim report, which concluded that the COVID-19 pandemic was most likely the result of a research-related incident. So coming out in favor of the lab leak theory. In it, it cites a couple compelling arguments or pieces of evidence that would indicate that a lab leak was more likely. But again, these are circumstantial. First is the director of the Wuhan Institute of Virology in May 2019 indicated that maintenance costs are generally neglected, and several high-level biosecurity labs like the Wuhan Institute of Virology have insufficient operational funds for routine yet vital processes. Next, there was an online depository of data on viral sequences published by the Wuhan Institute of Virology that was taken down in February 2020, so just weeks after the initial outbreak, and has not been re-established. Reading a little bit more into this interim report and trying to corroborate the intelligence community's hesitance to make a conclusion with this report's assertion that the lab leak theory is true, realized that this is an interim report on the origins of the pandemic and was produced solely by Republicans, by Health, Education, Labor, and Pensions Committee, the minority oversight staff. And therefore, given that Republicans are more likely to believe that the lab leak theory is true, this interim report indicates that the lab leak theory is true, even though, judging by the cover, it looks like it was produced by a Senate committee comprising members of both parties. So this is particularly disappointing when I found this out, because On the one hand, it cherry picks information to make the case for a preconceived impression on events that occurred. And that's just part of the game, part of politics, as Representative Foster noted.
Because in politics, it's often very different. If you see something interesting, the first question is often not what is true, but what can you convince people is true?
But these tactics are the same ones that are being used against the United States. They're the same lines of reasoning that Chinese government officials block further investigation into the pandemic's origins. In July 2021, the World Health Organization proposed a second phase of the study into the origins of the COVID-19 pandemic, which included audits of both laboratories and markets in Wuhan, with a particular call for transparency from Chinese authorities. The Deputy Health Minister of the Chinese National Health Commission, Zhang Yongzhen, dismissed the WHO's calls for investigation as disrespectful for common sense and arrogance towards science. Continuing, we hope the WHO would seriously review the considerations and suggestions made by Chinese experts and truly treat the origin tracing of the COVID-19 virus as a scientific matter and get rid of political interference. It should be noted that Mr. Zhang is the health minister at the National Health Commission, the same commission that forbid publication of any information about the disease on January 3rd, 2020. Mr. Zhang's assertions that further investigation is an affront to scientific inquiry is another example of what Representative Foster was talking about. In politics, if you see something interesting, the first question is not what is true, but what can you convince people is true? Instead of looking at the full set of facts, we cherry pick facts to support your position. And this analysis on the origins of the COVID-19 pandemic, the interim report, is an example of just that. Cherry picking information to support a position. Perhaps not as egregious as claiming that the lab leak theory is xenophobic and racist in 2020, but cherry picking nevertheless. And the reason I bring this up is we need to be careful. In our tactics and methods. And need to remember that there are not two theories regarding the lab leak theory, but four. I misspoke here. I meant that there are four theories regarding the origins of the COVID-19 pandemic. And while my personal opinion is that the lab leak theory is true, I would much rather 50 years from now, 100 years from now, have evidence prove that natural spillover was indeed the reason for the origin of the COVID-19 pandemic. I'd much rather have that be the accepted truth than that it was imported into China via frozen seafood or a creation of the US military. The encouraging thing is that while we tend to focus on the perspective of Chinese government officials, there are people like Dr. Ai and Professor Zhang who dedicate their lives to finding the truth. And these are the perspectives that are important to encourage and emphasize. As we try to navigate through everything that's going on in the world right now. Have a great Thanksgiving. Enjoy time with family and friends. And we'll speak soon.